Hello and welcome to the Language Revolution podcast. My name is Cate Hamilton. I'm a languages teacher and founder of Babel Babies. The aim of this podcast is to get people talking about talking. So without further ado, let's get started. In this first episode, I'm talking to Thomas Bak, who is a medic, a neuroscientist and a reader in neuroscience at Edinburgh University. Hi, Thomas.
Hi.
Thank you for joining me today. So I guess my first question is, why is a neuroscientist being interviewed on a languages podcast? What has neuroscience got to do with languages?
Well, I would say that languages have played a fundamentally important role in the development of our understanding of the brain. And that for the last few thousand years.
Right.
So the first example, for instance, I can tell of a selective deficit in cognitive functions caused by a specific brain lesion is aphasia, so loss of language, described in a manuscript from ancient Egypt 3,000 years ago.
Wow, 3,000 years.
So from this point of view, I would say, given how important language is for our functioning, how it defines us as a species and how it defines our life, in a way, language plays a very, very important role in neuroscience. In 19th century, again, the first descriptions, modern descriptions of association of specific deficits and specific brain lesions was aphasia described by Broca in 1861. So from this point of view, I could say that the work on language has been at the forefront on the work on our understanding of the brain and the relationship between brain, cognition, thinking, and so on, as I say, for thousands of years.
Okay, so scientists are completely fascinated by language and how it works and how our brain processes
Well, I don't
Yeah.
think we can really understand Homo sapiens, our species, without having a profound understanding of language as well, since, as I say, it is such a fundamentally important and defining feature of us.
That's right. It separates us from animals, doesn't it? So if we can talk about the brain then for a minute. So how does the brain store languages? Like if I cut open my brain, can I see the bit where languages are kept? Does it have like a compartment? Or?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is that the verb store might not be the one which, let's say, modern science would be using to describe it. And that is something which is very interesting, because I would say there has been a huge shift in our understanding, I mean, paradigm shift, you could say, in our understanding of the brain over the last few decades. When I started working in this field in the 70s, we had a view of the brain a little bit like a chest of drawers. So there, the term store would in fact really fit. So the idea was that we have this area dedicated to this function and this area dedicated to the other function and so on.
Is that, sorry to interrupt you, but is that where, the phrenology head, where you've got the lines?
Well, I mean, in some way, the
Yeah.
idea is similar. And when new neuroimaging methods appeared in the late 20th century, there was a criticism that basically what they are doing is what was called chromophrenology, colorful phrenology. So the difference to the models of 19th century is that instead of black and white, they are adding, the kind of nice orange and so on for brain activation. But the theoretical point was quite well made. Conceptually, they were using much more advanced technology, but conceptually they're very similar to the idea that you have, when you go to second-hand shops and you find this kind of nice brains from 19th century.
Yeah.
This has changed over the last few decades, also very much with the advance of technology, because we can now not only look at activities in certain areas, but at connectivity. So I would say that, we are still in the middle of the shift, so it's difficult to say the last word, but I would say we have seen a shift from areas to networks. So our understanding now is not so much that there are certain areas like cupboards where you have things stored. There are different networks which get active when we, for instance, think about certain concepts, use certain words, and so on and so on.
So it's not so much like a filing cabinet. It's more like a web?
I would say exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the things which I find fascinating is to what extent this change in our understanding also reflects the change in the reality of the world we are living in. In 60s, 70s, 80s, I mean, computers were very new and people were fascinated by the modules and putting together the modules and so on. The computers nowadays are much more interactive. They are not so deterministic. They can learn new things. We have the whole field of machine learning. And of course, I would say the probably single most important changed feature in our environment is the internet.
Yes.
And from this point of view, I think it's probably not a bad metaphor that we understand our brain a little bit more like, let's say, networks on Twitter or social media and so on, and internet, rather than like a chest of drawers.
Okay, so it's not like the chest of drawers is quite fixed, isn't it?
Yes.
So my next question is about if we have more than one language. So how do we envisage that? So do we have more than one web, or do we?
Yeah, I mean that's an extremely
Yeah.
good question. I would say that the old-fashioned area or chest of drawers or cupboard-based models of the brain had difficulty in accommodating multilingualism, because in a way the obvious question was, so if that is, so to say, the language area, if you speak then, two languages, does it mean that the second is kind of pushing the other away? Do they get, is it getting crowded when you put a third language in?
Yeah, because I've heard you before use a metaphor
right.
about the sock drawer.
Exactly. So the idea was that basically adding new languages will kind of in some way push the other things, or if we have too many languages, then it doesn't leave space for other things like math or physics or science and so on and so on. And this way of thinking is still very, very strongly, present in many people's minds. So I mean, you read, for instance, the ideas like, children should not learn languages because then they have no space to learn math and so on and so on. So it's still something which I would say certainly doesn't reflect our understanding of the brain at the moment, but it's very, very widely spread and decides how people conceptualize, for instance, languages.
Yeah.
So as I say, from this point of view, what I call limited resources models, or the cupboard models, are not particularly, don't lend themselves particularly to accommodate multilingualism. In networks models, it's, I would say, almost the opposite.
Yeah.
In a way, because adding something to a network can stabilize it. So you don't have competition. The whole point of a net is, so to say, if you add one more node to the net, you make the net stronger.
Yes.
So that means in the network models, adding a new language is an advantage. It strengthens the system. It makes it more stable. So from something which was competition for limited place, we move to something which is in fact integration. However, this requires integrating of the things with what we have. And that's where I think your way of thinking of languages as connected with each other is very much in the spirit of what I see from neuroscience, namely that we don't learn things separately.
That's right.
We learn things by integrating them in what we already know. And I think, for me, the way of learning languages that you advocate, which is basically not treating them as completely separate units, not interacting with each other, but rather as something which is, so to say, interactive, fits very, very nicely our current understanding of
that's
the
good,
brain.
because the way we teach languages is that, if you're learning about French, you also sort of accidentally, as a byproduct, you're learning some Spanish, Italian, Romanian, Portuguese at the same time. It's connected, and if you
and in fact English,
and English too, exactly. And there seems to be, as an English teacher, I've often been told that English isn't really a language like other languages. It's very much a language like other languages, and we can look for clues and we can decode, and our knowledge about one informs the whole, doesn't it? So I guess the model of the sock drawer, you're going to need to take some socks out if you want to add t-shirts. So there's a limited resource. Is that what you were saying?
Exactly.
Whereas with the network model, or like a web, the more threads that you add, the stronger the whole net becomes. So that seems to work well, doesn't it? So it's actually, our brain is perfectly capable of juggling more than one language. And
absolutely. I mean, in fact, there are good reasons to believe that language developed originally, so to say, as languages, namely in multilingual context. If we look at the society, I mean, more kind of hunter-gatherer, nomadic, pre-agricultural societies across the world, whether it's in the Amazon or in Papua New Guinea or in Aboriginal Australia, you will find that people are extremely multilingual. In fact, there is a very interesting phenomenon, I mean, described particularly in the Amazon, of linguistic exogamy.
Sorry, linguistic
exogamy.
Exogamy.
Yeah,
Okay.
where it is considered a taboo to marry someone who speaks the same language.
Oh yes, I've heard about that too.
So it means that basically all kids grow up with parents speaking different languages, and all adults are supposed to learn at least a new language when they marry.
Yeah, so this is where you have, say, a village where I've heard that it's usually the women who come to the man's village.
Yeah.
So there's one language that the men all have in the village, and then each female brings in kind of her language, and there could easily be, I don't know, how many languages might there be? There might be 6 or 20.
Or a dozen or so. Absolutely.
So the children have the language of the village, the environment, and then they've got parents who both speak different languages. And so is this a model that humans have had for a long time? Or?
Well, I think we can assume, I mean, obviously it's very difficult to kind of rerun our language evolution, so we have to speculate from what we have in the current situation. But given the fact that you have, so to say, these models of small-scale societies, as my friend and colleague Nick Evans called them, small-scale societies across the world, you have relatively stable communities of maybe a few hundred or a few thousand people speaking a certain language, and that was probably the model which is very close to how humans used to live before the development, well, first of agriculture and then definitely of kind of modern states, methods of communication and so on. So from this point of view, I think the important consequence for our understanding of the brain is that our brain originally developed to be able to accommodate multilingualism. So I think in a way it's not correct to speak about the bilingual brain or how bilingualism or multilingualism shapes our brain, because our brain is naturally multilingual, and I would say monolingualism is the odd one out. It's the special case in which, because of impoverished linguistic input, only one language was able to develop.
Okay, so actually our brain is naturally, ready and able, and it has developed over several thousand years to be multilingual.
Absolutely.
Being a speaker of one language is the...
Yep, and that brings us to the motto of the first International Day of Multilingualism that we had yesterday. Multilingual is normal.
Yes.
I know that there was quite a lot of debate about it, whether it's kind of exclusive and so on, but I think the main message, the important message is that we should not treat multilingualism as something strange, something rare, something that needs to be explained. In a way, it's monolingualism, which is rare, strange, that needs to be explained. And if we look, as I say, for most of the human history, most of people on this planet, up to the present day, in fact, are multilingual.
So do we know the total on the planet? So is it sort of 60% of people or 80%? I hear
it's always very difficult. I mean, I heard different numbers. It's always very difficult to know exactly because of, for instance, starting with the fact that a lot of multilingual people live in countries where you don't necessarily have a statistical infrastructure that would measure languages and so on. For instance, in Africa, Africa is extremely multilingual, but as I say, very often it's difficult to really, so to say, describe and classify it. Also, what you describe or you define as a language can be very different, and people very often don't even, let's say, they would not describe themselves as multilingual because it's simply self-evident.
Yes.
One of the very interesting comments that we got in the context of this, of the International Day of Multilingualism was, I think that someone was very surprised about the very high endorsement in UK and US.
Yes.
Now, of course, one of the reasons is very banal, that's where we have most of our contacts, that we are living, and that's, so to say, where we are interacting. But I think there's a second very interesting point. Both UK and US are, in fact, highly multilingual societies, but very, very monolingual ideologies. So there is a discrepancy, there is a tension between in fact, at least in many places, certainly places like London, for instance, a very multilingual reality and the official monolingual, or you could say normative monoglot ideology. Now, if you go to places, let's say like Africa or like India, people will not even think about it because it's so self-evident that you speak different languages, that you don't define yourself as multilingual because that's what people are.
Yes.
I mean, it's...
Exactly. I've encountered that where someone told me that they weren't very good at languages. And I said, well, hang on a minute, don't you speak 2 languages? It's like, oh, well, I've always spoken those, so that doesn't...
Yeah, it doesn't,
this doesn't count.
Exactly. So in a way, a kind of lovely example is when 2 years ago, when I was giving a talk for the African Society of Neuroscience in Entebbe in Uganda, the first question I got was from Tom Tago, with whom I'm in touch ever since, from Ghana. And he said, well, sir, I come from Ghana, and in Ghana we all speak, 3 to 4 languages usually. Is it much better when I speak 6, 7 or 8? Oh, so that is, to say, that is the baseline from which you start. So that means in some way that this hashtag that we had is not really necessary in a country like India or in many African countries because it's simply self-evident.
Yeah.
I would say this hashtag is important in countries where there's a discrepancy between the multilingual reality and the official monolingual ideology.
So what's been kind of growing over the decade that I've been involved teaching languages with babies is that people really, they're talking a lot more about having a bilingual baby. It's become, it's tradable now. It's like, big enterprises based around it. So can we talk for a minute now about the bilingual advantage? Is there this thing called the bilingual advantage that people seem to be basing, businesses around, and a lot of parents ask me, shall I try and introduce other languages? Is it good for the child sort of to have? Even if you are, say, in the UK where, and you're both English speakers, is it a good idea to try and introduce another language, and does it produce this advantage?
Personally, I don't like the term bilingual advantage because in a way it is also assuming that bilingualism is something strange which kind of has to be learned and then suddenly causes some advantages. In my model, as I say, bilingualism, multilingualism, in fact, is something very natural. Yeah. So if anything, there might be a monolingual disadvantage rather than bilingual advantage.
Okay, so a monolingual disadvantage, not a bilingual advantage.
Now the reason is, why do I think it's a difference? You could say it's just a kind of different way of looking at it, but I think it has important corollaries. Now, if we think of monolingualism, I sometimes compare monolingualism to the sedentary lifestyle. Basically, when we are living as hunter-gatherers, we didn't have the opportunity to spend most of our life in the sofa, watching television and drinking beer and so on. So in a way, in order to survive, we had to move, we had to walk, we had to run, and so on and so on.
Yes.
Now, most of us have sedentary jobs, so in a way, we don't have, in order to survive, to move.
Yes.
But we can compensate for that by going to the gym, by going walking, by doing or hill walking or cycling or jogging, and so on and so on.
Yes.
Now, in analogy, I would say multilingualism is for me one of the most natural ways of our mental stimulation. That is, so to say, the cognitive equivalent of running, for hunt or walking around looking for berries, so to say.
Okay.
Now, we don't need to do it nowadays because of the societies we live in. We can survive quite well speaking one language. But that leaves, so to say, a gap.
Yes.
This gap can be filled by conscious learning of languages, but it can be also filled by other mental activities, for instance, art, music, and so on and so on. So I wouldn't say that language is unique or the only way how we can train our mind. It is probably the most natural way.
Okay.
But we can compensate it. So from this point of view, my prediction would be, it's not that every monolingual will have, so to say, the set deficits, because many of them will compensate in thousands of different ways.
Yeah.
However, it means if you don't compensate at all, you end up like with sedentary lifestyle, you lack the mental activity. Now this can explain a very interesting detail of our evidence in modern bilingualism. Most studies that looked separately at people from different socio-economic and educational background found more difference, or in fact only difference, in people from lower and not higher socioeconomic background. And for me, it's not surprising. And that is something we find in results from California down to the studies that I was conducting with Suvarna Ladi and our Indian colleagues, where we found, for instance, that illiterates had a much stronger effect, protective effect of bilingualism than literates.
Is that because their brains are trying harder?
Well, no, I would say because for them, I mean, they don't have all this, so to say, cultural compensation. So for them, speaking more than one language is one of the main sources of, so to say, mental training.
Right.
Whereas if you live in a society where, you know, you go here to yoga classes and there to, you know, do astral art, and then you are doing creative writing course and so on and so on, you have, so to say, you have a lot of those activities. So from this point of view, as I say, I would expect the biggest effects, in fact, in people coming from lowest education. And here we come into kind of very, very interesting phenomenon, because as you mentioned, very often multilingualism, for instance, in Britain, is perceived as a kind of upper middle class, educated pleasure.
You know, people are aware that it might be a disadvantage if the children are not introduced to languages. And I think at this point, I'd like to sort of, you know, just, can we have a conclusive point? You know, is there a conclusive piece of evidence to say it's a great thing for children? I've heard things like it makes you better at maths. Children will be better at concentrating in school if they are using other languages. And that will have a knock-on effect that they will get a better, broader education because they're. Can language give you that kind of cognitive?
I mean, just to say,
boost,
well, to start with, scientific evidence is practically never conclusive in a way of kind of having one study which decides it. It is incremental. It depends very much where you conduct studies, so it depends on the population, on the situation, and so on. But what we can say is, I mean, the term I would use in this context is converging evidence. So we have evidence coming from different countries, different populations, different methods, suggesting that if anything, if there is a difference, it is in favor of multilinguals. So that means you find some studies which don't find differences, some studies which find differences, but it will be very rare to find studies showing indeed negative effects. So from this point of view, so to say, the big debate is not whether it's something positive or negative, the debate is rather whether there is no effect or whether there is an effect, and if there is an effect, it is assumed that it's mainly a positive one.
Okay, so what are some of the positive effects of learning more than one language? So,
well, I would say you can kind of group them in three interrelated areas. The first is probably the intuitively clearest, and that is what we call metalinguistic knowledge of languages, something which in fact you work with, so to say, every day. And, you know, I like always to give some examples from my daughter, who is now 6 and exposed at least to 3 languages, English, Polish and Spanish, although her Spanish is much better than her Polish. When she asked me one day how you say envelope in Spanish and Polish, I say, well, in Spanish they sobre, and in Polish they coperta. To which she said, yes, but coperta sounds Spanish to me.
it does, yeah.
She was absolutely right. Coperta is a Latin word which came to Polish via Italian. So it has a phonology which is much more similar to Romance languages than to Slavonic. So in a way, at that time she was 4 or so, so with 4 years, she already discovered certain correspondences, what sounds strange, what doesn't sound strange, and so on. And the same is true, by the way, for written language. So when she was looking at the word czerwone, which is the Polish for the color red, starting with the phoneme ch, she said, so in Polish, ch is written CZ, but in English and Spanish, CH. So practically, without any training or explanation, just from observation, she already discovered what we call the phoneme grapheme correspondence, and the fact that it is in a way different, or it can be different from language to language, that you have the very same or very similar phoneme ch in all three languages, but is rendered through different letter combinations in them. So from this point of view, I would say this is, so to say, very, very natural. So of course, if you speak different languages, you are much more likely to learn new ones. You don't perceive languages as something strange and so on. You rather have this kind of organic idea of languages relating to each other. In fact, I mean, now with my daughter, I'm kind of playing sometimes about English and German, where I'd ask her to predict how a certain word might be in German when she knows how it is in English. Now, the second area, so that's something which probably is, as I say, it applies both to spoken and written language, and I would say it's probably quite intuitive. I mean, that's probably where we need least convincing. The second interesting point is what we call social cognition. Now, again, to give an example from Alba, when I told her, let's say in Polish, that I have headache, which in Polish would be boli mnie głowa, she would walk to mommy and say that, mommy, daddy has sore head. She knew that mommy will not understand what means boli mnie głowa. If I said the same sentence in Spanish, me duele la cabeza, she would not translate because it's clear that mommy knows Spanish,
so
being Spanish.
So
exactly, so she knows very well who speaks which languages.
And what age was she when?
And that was, 3.5 or so, or 4. So kids learn very, very fast that different people know different languages. In fact, they also know which people learn languages. So about, some of our friends, she would say, oh, well, she speaks Spanish and he tries to speak Spanish. So they can distinguish very well who can, so to say, speak what.
Well, those social skills are...
Well, exactly. So the point is,
skills,
once you know that people have different knowledge of languages, it's only a very, very small step to discover what we call theory of mind, and that is that other people might have knowledge that we don't have, but we might have knowledge that other people don't have. That is something which children find many children find not so easy to learn. It takes a while to distinguish between their own perspective and the perspective of others.
I've read about an experiment where the interviewer has a box and an object.
Exactly.
And this is where the scientist puts the object where the child can see it, but they can't see it. And is it true that the bilingual children are quicker to work out that the scientist can't see the same?
Exactly. I think that was one of the studies from Kinsler Lab in the US. And I mean, they are very, very nice, elegant studies showing that bilingual children are much faster in getting the gist that people have different perspectives and they don't identify their perspective as the only one.
Yes, I suppose the children who spoke one language sort of was slower to
That's
work
right.
out.
I mean, they find it out as well, but as I say, it's more difficult.
But they were just slower to work out that the interviewer couldn't see the object because their perspective was different.
Absolutely,
Right,
absolutely.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? Because that creates a sort of more empathy. You can see someone else's point of view.
At least understanding that you have different points of view, absolutely. But now comes the kind of third area, which is probably the most contested one, but for me also very interesting, kind of logically connected to the first two, or definitely the second. Now, all the theoretical knowledge, who speaks which language, would not be of any use without some mechanism of control that allow you to speak the correct language, the correct person. So let's say, if Alba would know that she can speak Polish with me and Spanish with mommy and then Spanish with both or whatever, but she didn't have the method of controlling, the words would be coming as a kind of mixed garbage, there would be no way she could adjust to it. So in order
do you mean she wouldn't be able to separate her languages?
So in order to translate your knowledge about people's specific, so to say, language repertoires, you need what we call executive functions in order to translate it into action.
So is that like a dashboard, like a control panel, or
I mean, basically, most multilingual people know exactly which combination of languages they can speak with whom. So one important thing is, for instance, language mixing, code switching, and so on is very, very common. So let's say if I speak as a multilingual with someone with whom I share 2 or 3 languages, I will mix them. So I'm first in a fortunate situation to have a colleague of mine, Kasia Przybycień, who works for Bilingualism Matters, and she has exactly the same combination, I would say, of the 4 main languages, namely Polish, German, English, and Spanish.
Okay.
So when I speak with her, I can put, we can start speaking English and then we can switch to another language, or I can say something in Spanish, add something in German.
And if you can't remember a word...
Exactly, I can put in another language.
Yeah.
Of course, when I speak with someone who doesn't have these 4 languages, I know that I have to, so to say, filter out those languages that the other person doesn't know. So that means you have, so to say, a kind of mental map as multilingual, which combinations of languages you can use with whom.
Yeah.
And as I say, socially, that is something which you can do, but you still need your mechanism of monitoring in order really to activate, to use the correct language in the correct context.
That's right. I've heard one of my colleagues has an Italian husband and their children are English and Italian speakers. And the nursery was a little bit concerned that the daughter, who was 2, kept asking, for milk, latte in Italian, and then the nursery teachers didn't understand, and they were very supportive. And actually, it was just the child doing kind of an experiment and working out.
Yeah.
If I speak Italian here, that won't work, so I'll use my other language. And very quickly, she worked out that we speak English at nursery, and at home I can speak English or Italian. It doesn't really matter because everybody understands both. And she could just sort it out. It's an incredibly young age to...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that shows also another kind of very, very common prejudice against bilingualism, and namely the fear that bilingualism or multilingualism confuses people.
Yes.
The word confusion is probably the most commonly used inappropriate term in the context of multilingualism. The only people who get confused by multilingualism are monolinguals.
So just people who speak one language?
Exactly, because they think, because they cannot even imagine that there could be more than one language. So, of course, their conceptualization of multilingualism is confusion.
Right.
You don't find, children don't get confused. They might get sometimes, for instance, if one language is dominant, you might have the influence of that language on the other. So they will, for instance, translate grammatical structures from one language to the other and
or
so
use
on.
German word order.
Exactly, if it's, so to say, one of them is more dominant. But it is not because they are confused and they don't know that they are 2 languages, but because one is, so to say, much stronger than others. We have it as well when we learn languages as adults, that, for instance, we might be inclined, at least in the beginning, to take our syntactic structures and then, so to say, put the words of another language. Yeah. So it's not confusion in terms of not knowing, it's simply a kind of imbalance in which one structure, one way of expressing things is stronger than the other. The same, by the way, appears also when we speak about, one of the areas of my particular interest, language learning, language use in later life. Yes. When Lingua Flamingo in Glasgow had the wonderful idea of offering language courses to people, older people and even patients with dementia, one of the objections or hesitations that were expressed, for instance, by nursing home staff and so on was, well, but that will confuse patients. They will get agitated. We'll have to sedate them. So in a way, there was kind of idea that there will be something dangerous happening, a kind of panic, which is for me a kind of very typical monolingual prejudice against. And in fact, we have now done the evaluation of the first, so to say, courses. It goes very well. I don't think we had one single example of someone who would become agitated through being exposed to another language. And there's another, I think, dramatic example of this, and that is the national census. Right. So, Britain is, interestingly, in some way, a very progressive country in that in national census, already in 2011, the questions planned for the next census 2021, people are allowed to name multiple ethnic and national identities.
Right.
So you can feel as being Scottish and British, or in fact you can be even Italian and British if you want. Yes. You can feel that you have a mixed, Southern Asian and European or whatever ethnic heritage. However, you are only allowed one language.
And is this where it says, what is your main language?
Exactly, and the assumption is you can only put one, there is one language, there is no provision, for instance, that you might speak one language at home and the other at work, let alone that you might use, for instance, more than one language at home. So it's very strong. The normality is, so to say, here is a very, very nice example of a normative monolingualism being forced upon society.
It is, because it's very easy for just a person who speaks one language to say what their main language is. But I have 3 children, for example. It's a bit like saying, which is your main child?
Exactly. Absolutely that.
I'm quite fond of all 3 of them.
Absolutely that. So for me...
I couldn't pick a main child.
For me, it's very easy to say who is my main child, because I have only one daughter. But exactly as you say. And, you know, what would mean main child? Is the main child, is it the one, the firstborn or the lastborn, or the one who is, you know, behave best, or the one who behave worst and makes most problem, and so on. That is absolutely unclear. But the interesting thing is, I mean, we are campaigning together with, you know, some academic colleagues. We are campaigning for a change, practically, to put language in line with ethnicity and nationality as something which allows you multiple choices. And one of the main arguments is again, oh, but if we allow people to name more than one language, they will be confused. Of course they won't. No. The monolinguals would be confused, but they don't have a language, there's no problem.
Because normal is your normal, isn't it?
Exactly. So, you know, so you can see here how the monolingual norm is really forced upon people. Now, interestingly, we asked the statistical office in New Zealand, which is one of the countries which allows multiple options, whether they have experienced ever confusion what to name. They say, no, there's absolutely no confusion. That's the only way we can do justice to our society in which more than one language are being spoken. So, if you have this question, people don't get confused.
No, exactly. It seems like it's just obvious to me.
So in some way, I would say maybe one of the symptoms of monolingualism as a pathological condition is an irrational fear of languages, of confusion caused by languages.
That's it. It's really interesting, isn't it? Well, thanks, Thomas, because it seems to me, just to sum up here, that the brain is perfectly capable of learning multiple languages. That humans have done it for millennia, and it's perfectly natural, but there's some sort of barrier to attitudes, really. And perhaps we'll get, we're going to have a couple of more conversations, and we'll get into more detail. And in our next conversation, we're going to talk about your dementia research and how learning languages is really important for our health. And this has been really interesting to understand exactly how normal it is to speak languages, and how we're actually really primed and ready to do it, aren't we? We've got all the tools that we need. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Speak to you again soon.